So we've just finished our How to Compose Music series, and as promised, today we're going to start looking into how to write simple yet effective MIDI orchestrations of your themes and record demos using MIDI and DAW and sound libraries. Let's use our first theme in the series to explain the basics. So we recorded this demo using a MIDI keyboard, and our DAW was Logic Pro. But what is MIDI? MIDI stands for Musical Instrument Digital Interface. Explaining the MIDI protocol in detail isn't really necessary to start using it, but it's essential that we understand just a few of the concepts so that we can use MIDI correctly. First thing to note is that there's actually no actual audio in MIDI. It's just a bunch of numbers that represent notes, velocities, and other information. When you play a note on a MIDI keyboard, these numbers are sent via a MIDI cable or some other medium like Bluetooth. Every note has a number assigned between 0 and 127. Middle C's number is 60, and C sharp is 61, 62, 63, and so on. Also, every time you play a note on your MIDI keyboard, the keyboard also sends another number that represents how hard you press the key. This is known as the velocity, and it's also a number between 0 and 127. So if I play the note really loud, the keyboard will send a higher velocity number than if I play it softer. So every time you play a note, it sends the note and the velocity. And when you lift your finger from the key, the keyboard sends a note number and a note off with a 0 velocity. That's all the MIDI keyboard is really doing, sending numbers via the MIDI cable. Now again, there's no audio information at all in MIDI. And of course, there are many other things that the keyboard can send via MIDI, like when you press the sustain pedal or you move the modulation wheel. But that's not really important right now. So then why are we hearing music when the keyboard plays? Well, the MIDI cable from the MIDI out in my keyboard is connected to the MIDI in of my MIDI interface. And Logic is constantly listening to my MIDI interface. When a MIDI message comes in, Logic knows it right away. And Logic is known as a DAW, a digital audio workstation. And a DAW is an app that can react to MIDI or audio information that comes into your audio MIDI interface. It can record it, play it back, or even edit it. If I have a MIDI track in Logic that's listening to the MIDI messages from the MIDI interface, then it can react to those messages. I can hit record, and then every time I play a note on the keyboard, it's saved in that track at the exact moment that it was received. But again, these are just numbers, so where's the sound coming from? Well, every MIDI track can be loaded with a MIDI instrument, a synth or a sampler. Then, every time a note is being played on that track, your DAW will send it to the sampler. And it's the sampler that will turn those MIDI messages into actual audio. The cool thing about it is that if I change the sampler to a flute sound, then it will turn all of the MIDI messages into a flute sound. Also, if I hit record and play a bunch of notes, then I have every single note stored at the exact moment that they were played as a pair of numbers, the note and the velocity. Your DAW also allows you to edit these numbers, and the visual interface in today's DAWs are really intuitive to work with. I can change the note number by dragging the notes up or down. Or change the velocity to make the notes louder or softer. Or change the time at which the MIDI messages were received by dragging the beginning or the end of the notes. If I make a new track with another instrument, I can copy and paste all the MIDI data from one track to another and have my melody played by two completely different instruments. Or tweak the notes to make a harmony. And finally, what do you do when you're done with your MIDI mockup? You can't just send a MIDI file to someone. They would need all the samplers and a DAW to listen to the same thing that you're hearing. You have to bounce it into audio first. So in Logic, I just select all the tracks and choose Bounce. And it will render all the MIDI data into audio for you. Now you have an audio track. It sounds exactly the same as the MIDI version, but it's just a WAV file, and you can export this as a single audio file. In our first theme, we just used a piano sampler, so everything that I played on my MIDI keyboard was recorded into one MIDI track loaded with a piano sampler sound. And all the reverb and piano qualities were tweaked inside of that sampler. In every sampler, you have ways of tweaking how the MIDI notes will be processed, like the response to the velocity curve, and the room where we put the piano in. I can even open or close the lid of that piano. Or even make the noise from the hammers louder or softer. All of these properties have nothing to do with the MIDI notes that are recorded here. These are all, again, attributes of the sampler. So I hope that was helpful and that now you have a better understanding of the difference between MIDI and audio and how to use MIDI to create audio demos of your pieces. If you already have the How to Compose Music for Video Games and Film book, we'll be adding all of these videos to the playlist for the book. On our upcoming videos, we'll be taking a closer look at some of the really interesting techniques that we used to create each of the MIDI orchestrations for all the themes in the book. Thanks again for watching. We'll see you on the next video.